Hello, welcome to the show. My name is Vazaskia and I'm the Director of Equity and Social Justice here at the King County Council. Today we will be interviewing Sean Goode with Choose 180. But first, let's watch the reel.
I started meeting with Javon back in January.
My mom just put me into a program with a mentor, so I wasn't really sure about it at first.
Basically, every Friday, I come here, we talk about his social goals, we talk about his family.
But then I was just like, shoot, could be a good experience.
At least we're aware of our actions, right? Yeah. It's about being aware so we can make a different decision. So tell me about a time that you made that different decision.
Choose 180 is a nonprofit organization. Our foremost goal is to transform systems of injustice to no longer do harm to communities, particularly the Black and Brown community. And we do that through these strategic relationships, like the one we have with the King County Prosecuting Attorney.
What the program aims to do is to not, seek to label a kid for a mistake. It seeks to help a kid make better decisions.
Last year, we supported a little over 500 youth and young adults through a variety of different programmings. Our Choose 180 workshops, when it comes to the youth, over 75% of them don't re-engage the criminal legal system within 12 months of participating in our program. But what's more impressive to me is that each one of those young people are connected to a family. And because that young person is able to go home to their family and not get caught up in the criminal legal system, they're able to be a part of that family, which means that community is better because that young person is better because that family is better.
And in many ways, that's accountability, right? It doesn't always have to be a jail cell or a judge or a courtroom or a prosecutor for that matter.
Some young people are criminalized for behavior and other young people aren't because of the neighborhoods they live in and the frequency of law enforcement and police in those spaces. The difference between a young person who's successful and a young person who has challenges has everything to do with the community surrounding them.
At the end of the day, I'm human. So I make heck of mistakes. Just because you guys don't see them don't mean I don't make them. My role in all of this is to allow the youth to be able to express their truth to an adult and that adult to be able to articulate that to the parent. What about you in relation to your goal? Where are you? How was last year? Tell me about your school experience. And we also try to do something fun.
If it wasn't for Kaisha, I probably would have been repeating the 6th grade. So, yeah, it's a lot of positive things I have to say about the program.
I love working with people because it just reminds you that we all go through stuff and we all just want to be heard.
Welcome back. I'd like to introduce you to Sean Goode, who is the Executive Director of Choose 180.
Well, thank you. It's good to be in space with you.
It's good to be in space with you as well. So tell us a little bit more about Choose 180.
Yeah, well, we are a nonprofit organization that works to transform systems, communities, and lives through the power of choice. And we do that by intentionally partnering with system leaders like prosecutors, folks who work in the courts, law enforcement, school superintendents, folks that hold those positional places of power, to change the way they administer justice and discipline while supporting the young people who are disproportionately impacted by those systems. Ultimately, we desire to create a world where adolescent behavior isn't criminalized and every young person has the opportunity to be seen as a possibility to be developed and not a problem to be solved.
So tell me some of the programs that are offered here. I know that you work with credible messengers and coaches to work with the youth, but what are some of the programs that happen with Choose 180?
Well, in its infancy, our work began in 2011 in a partnership with the Prosecuting Attorney's Office, offering what's called a pre-filing diversion program, which essentially means that when young people who live in neighborhoods that are overly policed are criminalized for their behavior, typically law enforcement sends that referral to the prosecutor, and then that prosecutor refers that young person to the courts. But because of a relationship established with Dan Satterberg, back in 2011, the prosecutors send that referral to the community, so a young person has the opportunity to receive authentic community instead of a criminal conviction. And they participate in our 4-hour seminar, and throughout the course of that time, they receive grace instead of guilt and have a chance to be connected with people with similar experiences and learn a decision-making tool we call the Compass to help them make better choices as they move forward. And in that principal program, between the 12 to 24-year-olds we serve, About 90% of them don't return to the criminal legal system within 12 months of participating in our program, which seems to be a much better alternative than criminalizing behavior, but creating a pause to be able to hear what the behavior is telling us and teach the young people how to navigate the world differently as a result of what they're experiencing.
Well, talk to me a little bit more about your school-based diversion program.
Yeah, so what happened was after years of serving young people through court diversion type stuff, we realized that so many of those young people had been previously suspended or expelled. And as a result, we leaned into one of our neighboring districts and asked to take a look at the discipline data. And a vastly disproportionate amount of Black and brown kids were being suspended and expelled for what's the equivalent of insubordinate behavior. And candidly, what teenager hasn't been insubordinate? But when a Black or brown teenager is insubordinate because of implicit bias, that insubordination is threatening, and they don't get the same grace or leeway as a child from the dominant culture would. And so we began to partner with Highline Public Schools to create a pause for young people who would otherwise be suspended or expelled, walk them through our curriculum, and also support the school district in changing the way that it's administering discipline so they can do less harm. I mean, ultimately, we don't want to do this work forever. We believe in a world where young people aren't being criminalized for their behavior. And if we're going to live into that world, we have to be actively changing the systems of injustice while supporting the young people who have been harmed by them.
So, Sean, you work with a lot of youth. What are some of the things that the youth are asking for? What are they missing?
More often than not, they want to be heard. When a young person's voice is silenced, particularly when they're having a behavioral episode that puts them at danger to themselves or others, they continue to shout louder, and often their behavior is the only voice they know how to use. And when we don't listen to that behavior, and instead we demonize that behavior, stigmatize that behavior, we only push them further to the margins and keep them from being a part of a community that's looking forward to enveloping them instead of pushing them out. And our young people want to be heard. There's a lot going on in community, and there are many levels of trauma and pain that our young people are navigating through. And sometimes it shows up in a toxic way that causes harm. And when it does, we need to hear what's happening and respond to what's happening, and not just respond to what's been done. I mean, how many of us have things that we've done in our past that we regret? Things that we look back on and we're like, man, if I would have, or if I did, or because I did, things are so much different. Our young people are no different than that. There's many moments of poor decision making that'll happen throughout the course of a young person's life. That young person wants to be heard when that decision's made and not criminalized when that decision's made. That young person wants to be supported when that decision's made and not sent to juvenile detention when that decision's made. That young person wants to be experienced as fully human. And as community-based organizations, we have the opportunity to allow that young person to walk into space with us, fully human, and honor them in their humanity.
So tell me, are you working with their families as well?
Yeah, we're fortunate to be positioned in a place where we understand a young person isn't a silo in and of themselves. A young person is connected to a school, connected to a peer group, and most importantly, connected to some sort of adults in their life that are their family. And over the course of our workshops, we do support the connected adults, and we're actively looking at new ways to engage the adults connected to young people's lives. Recently, when we began to support young folks with a behavioral health specialist here at Choose 180, it became clear from all the parent feedback that they're excited for the support that the young person's getting, but they also need support too. And so we're actively working to put together a support group for parents who are working with their young people to better understand how to hear them and not just respond to them.
I know you've been a sought-out speaker on a national level, locally. You've been doing a lot around the COVID pandemic, the Black racism, police reform, as well as addressing a number of issues of inequities and social injustices. Can you talk to me about how this has actually had an impact on your program and the youth and families that you serve?
Yeah, well, let me start by saying when COVID hit, that was the new variable for us. Systemic racism has always been something that we're actively working to combat as an organization, so that's nothing new. And we're grateful that the Director of Health proclaimed it as a public health issue in Martin Luther King Jr. County. Those of us that have been suffering from the disease of racism that's embedded in so many different aspects of our culture have known very well that it's been a pandemic for as long as we've been inhaling and exhaling on this continent. And so I would say that COVID was definitely a curveball, but fortunately, we have a team full of people with lived experience that are incredibly resilient. And as soon as we realized we needed to pivot and begin to offer services differently, instead of panicking, they rallied together. I was sharing with folks that we often say that these are uncertain times. Well, calling something uncertain is a privilege. Many of the people who work with us at Choose 180 grew up in the midst of uncertainty. And so we know very well that most times that they are uncertain. And so it was nothing new for us to navigate a pivot because we're constantly in a space of adjusting the way that we're serving to make sure we're best honoring the needs of our young people. The social unrest was a whole nother element altogether. And I can't share with you the level of frustration that I carry when George Floyd is pointed to as a catalyst for the protest, when in reality, here in Martin Luther King Jr. County, we have our own incidents of state-sanctioned violence that our local officials and police representatives very rarely accept as part of why we are marching in the streets, part of why we are asking for a reallocation of resources, part of why we are stubbornly standing together with unity, because things must be different this time round. And that actually impacted us dramatically. I mean, consider that we were already knee-deep in this work of justice reform, and then this wave of enthusiasm pushed upon the shores. And all of a sudden, we're head and neck deep and trying to get above water while everybody's getting caught up to speed around the injustices that we've been working to combat for all of these years. So we have adjusted by creating the space for more young people to learn how to be advocates so they can leverage their voice to be able to speak to the change that they desire, by creating a role for somebody whose role is fixated on system change and community engagement so we can make sure our organization is actively present in the places that we need to be, and leveraging the platform that we've been granted through our service to be able to help inform the public on what we really mean when we talk about repurposing money from law enforcement and reinvesting that in community, and breaking down some of the stigmatization that's been present as a result of the way we talk about these things.
You've been extremely effective in your partnerships. And so we talk oftentimes about the community being the answer. Mm-hmm. And you have been effectively partnering with different institutions. And so I think as we move forward and we see more allocation of resources to the community, people would like to know, what makes a successful partnership? Yeah. How have you been able to leverage those relationships with institutions to support Choose 180?
Yeah, well, first I'd like to say that we're leveraging those relationships to support the community's needs and not a single organization. We stand on a platform of grace. We believe that grace is a far greater indicator for change than guilt ever can be. And so if we give a young person grace, then that grace in turn can transform their life. But grace selectively applied is favoritism. So if we only extend grace to the families and the young people we're serving and hold back extending that same grace to our system partners, then we're actually just playing favorites. And the minute that we begin to play favorites and other those that other, then we become the other and inadvertently become our own enemy. So it is imperative that we stand on this platform of grace and continue to build a bridge to those that we have disagreements with, understanding that that is the way forward. Now, I will say that a good partner and a good system partner is looking for the opportunity for things to live in community and not live within the system. And that's one of the greatest barriers we have at this time, is so often brilliant ideas are made manifest in community, and then system folks want to take those great ideas and make them a system process and not let it live and thrive and flourish in the community spaces it was born out of. And to the credit of the prosecuting attorney's office, back in 2011, 180 was initially inside of the prosecutor's office, but they soon realized that it needed to live in community, be stewarded by community in order for it to grow to its fullest potential. And those types of relationships and that type of mechanism are how we change things holistically. We must stand on a platform of grace, understanding that we are going to disagree, but also standing firmly in our position that these solutions live in community, so they need to be resourced in community, supported in community, fostered and developed in community, because our young people at the end of the day, they don't need to engage system. They need to engage the people who live and grow and breathe and eat and share space with them day in and day out in the community.
I think that'll be really beneficial for system partners to understand where and what the needs are. So my final question for you today is, what gives you hope, Sean?
What gives me hope is the journey that's been traveled by our ancestors. I think back last summer when I stood on the riverbank in Montgomery, Alabama, and considered the slave ships that would come in and offload our ancestors and walk them up and put them into warehouses and then walk them up a little bit further and sell them on the slave block, and how somehow throughout the midst of all of that, they survived. I think about when I was standing outside the now empty store in Money, Mississippi, where Emmett Till was falsely accused. And I looked across from the store to the field where he would have ran to his uncle's house, where he was later pulled from and brutally murdered. And what his mother went through and what their family went through, and the awakening that should have been at that moment for our country to go through and experience something different. And I think about when I stood outside the motel in Memphis, Tennessee, where the good Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had showed up for the sanitation worker strike, as 2 sanitation workers were killed in the back of a dump truck because they were forced to ride on the back of the truck and weren't allowed to ride inside the cab on a cold day, and how he was murdered in that hotel room. And that was some almost 50, 60 years ago. And the conversations they were having at that time are very similar to the conversations that we're having today. So the hope that I carry forward is the understanding that our ancestors survived. Our ancestors ran this race and did so in a way so we could pick up the baton and carry the relay and move this thing forward. My hope comes from the fact that as I look around the community, and even in Martin Luther King Jr. County, where 7 to 8% of people are African American, I see people standing in position, ready to hold the baton and carry this thing forward so that my son and my daughter and their children and their children's children won't have to be having these conversations that we're having today, and that they'll truly live into a future that mirrors the dream that the good Dr. King spoke of and is less reflective of a hope unrevealed.
Well, Sean, you give me hope.
Thank you.
Thank you for being on the show. I look forward to seeing Choose 180 and the progress of our community with leaders like you.
I'm grateful for the platform, the space to share, and I'm honored by the space that you hold and the fact that I can be one of many people in this community working hard day in and day out to have an impact on the behalf of all of our young folks.
Again, I want to thank you for being on this show. I look forward to seeing the progress of Choose 180 as well as the progress in our community moving forward. And I want to thank you for tuning into the show. Remember, the community is the answer.